What is an unschooled mind?
When I began to become interested in education, I realized that I needed to articulate what my own education philosophy was. And I realized that in my own education, before college, there was nothing particularly distinctive about it, but that in the education my children had had, and the education that I'd had in working with Jerome Bruner in the middle 60s, and then also I said I taught for a year in a school, the same school where we had done research with Bruner. I had developed an educational philosophy of sorts, and so I decided that I should write about it. And at the same time, I was still very much a consumer of the literature on children's cognition. And the thing that had struck me the most in reading this literature, this was in the 70s and 80s, was the power of early misconceptions. A lot of what we try to do in education is to get rid of simple-minded ideas. For example, the earth looks flat, so it's flat, right? If you can't see something anymore, it doesn't exist. Every species was created at the same time and has never changed. If you drop a coin and a piece of paper from the same time, the coin falls more quickly to the ground. In any society, you have the good guys and the bad guys, and the purpose is for the good guys to win. And these are the ideas which people develop when they're young, even if they're not taught them. They're kind of, we might say, the intuitive theories that young people have. And a lot of education should be designed to complexify the way we think about things. I mean, if you think about American foreign policy over the last 50 years, it's kind of one bad guy after another, whether its name is Fidel Castro or Manuel Noriega or Saddam Hussein or bin Laden, and we get rid of those bad guys, everything will be fine. Of course, it's never turned out to be the case, and it still isn't going to be the case. So in the unschooled mind, I try to lay out what these early uneducated, untutored theories of the world are, and to show from ample data that even when people are, quote unquote, taught to think differently over the years, if you examine them off-site, when they're not taking an exam, those old theories are very, very powerful, and they're very hard to erase. This is most dramatically conveyed by a film made some years ago of Harvard and MIT students graduating with their black robes and their hat on. And some interviewer says to them, well, why is it warmer in the summer than it is the winter? And one kid after another says, well, because the earth is closer to the sun in the summer than it is in the winter. And that's not the right answer, but it's an intuitive answer. And even those people have degrees from elite institutions, they still think in the same unschooled kind of way. Or people will study the First World War, and they'll learn it's a very powerful set of factors which contributed to the guns of August. There are political ones, economic ones, mercantile ones, ethnic strife, etc. And they say, well, what's going on in the world now? And they say, well, there's this bad guy named Osama bin Laden, we got to get rid of him. So there's no transfer of that complex way of thinking from history to what's going on nowadays. So in the unschooled mind, I first lay out the power of these early conceptions and theories, and then I try to talk about things that we can do, what I call Christopherian encounters. I named after Christopher Columbus because, if you think the earth is flat, and then you keep sailing, you should never come back to where you started. You should just keep going until you fall off or keep going forever. The sorts of things which make those early theories more fragile. And then what you need to do, which is very hard, nobody's figured out how to do it quickly, is how to get people to think more sophisticatedly about things. Because otherwise, why go to school? And even though you didn't ask me this, my subsequent work after The Unschooled Mind, The Disciplined Mind, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, those are two books I wrote at approximately 10-year intervals, are all efforts to figure out, well, how do you have the kind of education which we need to make people think more sophisticatedly? And in this most recent book, what do we do with the philosophical threat of postmodernism and relativism, which in a sentence say, how the hell do you know what's true? Or if what I think is beautiful isn't the same as you, how can we use the word beauty? And the digital media, where anything can be posted, changed, revised, morphed, transformed in any moment. It's much, much harder to teach the traditional virtues, the traditional values, when you have these philosophical and technological things. So even though I've been lucky enough to write about many different things, that's one of the great things about a scholar, our dean, another dean once said, well, I want you people all to study X. And I said at a faculty meeting, well, you can tell us what to teach, but you can't tell us what research to do. I've been able to study what I want, even if that professor, when I was at graduate school, wanted to flunk me out, and people did not want to give me tenure. But I think there are certain through lines. And when I worked in Man, A Course of Study in 1965 with Jerry Bruner, when I was just a kid out of school, there were 3 questions, and I'd forgotten them for years, but in a way they're questions I'm still asking. What makes human beings human? How do they get that way? And what can make them more so? And what's the Good Work Project? It's an effort to say, what can make us more so? And when asked what's human, my contribution, if there is to think not just about science, about art, but art and other fields as well. I did want to say something else. I've been incredibly privileged not only to have a job and to be able to do research in the United States and to get funded, not often without lots of efforts, and to be in a very privileged community, of scholars. And I could easily understand people watching this tape if they've been patient enough and to say, well, what does he have to say to people who don't have that kind of privilege? Should he be attempting to say how people should live and what good work and good citizenship is? And I think that that's a valid critique. I remember once talking to the people who run Renaissance Weekend, and the person who runs it, and who we're friends, said, Howard, you need to go to teach for a few years in the South or in the Middle West and get off your very privileged niche. And while I travel a lot, I have never done that. In fact, the place I spent the most time in other than the United States was China, through a fluke. And I actually wrote a book about China in the 1980s, so that's a long time ago. But I don't know Chinese, so the understanding of China has to be very limited. But the answer I would give to what I think is a very reasonable, hey, wait a minute kind of statement is that I shouldn't therefore come to the conclusion I shouldn't try to make things better, that I shouldn't try to influence the educational system, that I shouldn't try to promote good work and good citizenship. I may not be doing it in the best possible way. I'm almost certainly going to fail because almost everybody fails. But the question is, do you make an effort or not? And I believe I should make an effort. And it's up to people who have taken the trouble to read what I've written or to listen to me to criticize them. I never go to rate my professor, and I never will, because I don't care what people say about me if they don't know me. But I read my students' criticisms, which are given anonymously, so I don't know students, very carefully, because they do know me. And similarly, when people say dismissive things about my work, the first question I ask is, have you actually read it? And if they've read it, then I pay attention to it. But if they say, MI theory is silly, but it's quite clear they have no idea what I'm saying, then I don't pay attention to it. And that has to do with my wider notion of human discourse and human intercourse, namely, anything that's raised seriously deserves to have an answer. But things that are raised frivolously are not. And in my teaching, and now I've taught for many years, if people take nothing away from what I teach, not a single substantive thing, they remain every bit as unschooled as they were before. If there are 2 things that they get, then I feel I've been successful. One is, if somebody asks a serious question or asks a non-facetious question, they deserve an answer. And if it's kind of, out of ignorance, you should be kind, but try to help them be less ignorant. And you should know what's going on in the world. So I never teach without reading the newspaper. I still read a physical newspaper and listening to the radio. Even when I'm abroad, I now look at the newspaper online, and I talk about what's happening these days. Because if you don't know what's going on in the world, what are you here for? You know, we're all here for a speck of time, and you should know what's going on, and you should relate what's happening in the world to you. I'll tell a story just from last week. We're now talking in March of 2013. We had a big cheating scandal at Harvard in the last spring, and I became very involved in trying to understand why so many students cheated, and I identify with the institution, so I became very central there. And then we had a case of a dean, for motivations which are not particularly relevant, giving a green light to looking at the email of another dean. And this caused a huge explosion in certain parts of the campus and was upsetting to many people, including me. And I was about to go to a faculty meeting. And I knew the faculty meeting we were going to look at a dossier of candidates, because that's what we do at faculty meetings. But I called my dean and I said, I'd like to say something about what's happening on campus. And I had a 3-minute written speech because I didn't want to take up a lot of time. But I read aloud at the beginning of the meeting, and I said, I'm doing this in part to bear witness. I don't have any particular answer to these things, but when something this important is going on in the campus, I think we need to take note of it, and we at least need to think about what we ought to do. And a few people came afterwards and actually had some ideas. And this is how I, in my very low-bore way, as my friend Bill Damon said, once in a while I manage to eke out a moral act, a way in which I try to get people to think about what's happening every day and not just be in our foxhole, which is so easy to do.
Sure. Your extensive publishing career includes to date more than 20 books translated into 28 languages and several hundred articles. In addition to numerous awards and honors, you have received honorary degrees from 26 colleges and universities. In 2005 and 2008, you were selected by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines as one of the 100 most influential public intellectuals in the world. In 2009, you published a book, Multiple Intelligences Around the World, in which 42 authors from 15 countries on 5 continents wrote about how they had used multiple intelligences theory. What is next for you?
Well, that's sort of an embarrassing introduction.
You can't say nothing.
What's the joke? I liked it, my mother believed it. One thing about me is I love when my ideas have influence, but I don't have a cult of personality. I always say I don't want to be recognized in the airport.
Yeah.
And I hope that some of these ideas will have benign influence, but I don't wallow in that. Until about 6 months ago, what I would have said is that I'm trying to get the multiple intelligences legacy straight. That's the reason for the MI Oasis website. And I'm trying to consolidate the various good work enterprises. We started with the Good Work Project, but we now have this umbrella of the Good Project because we have good work, good play, good collaboration, good life, and so on. And each of these are little areas of research and practice. And I really don't care if people have heard of the Good Work Project or not, or the Good Project, but I care that we make strategic alliances with other places and people that are doing similar things. So we had a conference, again in March of 2013, about the Good Project, and there were people there from Finland, Sweden, Australia, India, the British Isles, and so on. And this is not for our glory, it's to try to get people who are also interested in ethics and in good work. So I would have said that, but in part because of the scandals at Harvard, the cheating and the surveillance, and I'm also on the board of Amherst College, and we've had very bad sexual harassment there. At Oberlin College, there's racial and ethnic slurs. The price of liberal arts education is sky high in this country, and many people are saying, what do we get for the money? We have massive open online courses, MOOCs, which could be good or bad, but certainly look like they're going to be challenging residential liberal arts education, and I would say moving towards skills rather than thinking and reflecting, and hyper-vocationalism on the part of American young people, for which there's some reason, but also I think is way overblown. probably the worst thing is to say, I want to follow this particular job, and that's all I'm being trained for, because that job could be gone in 2 years, and then you're completely bereft. So that's the elevator speech. With a colleague named Richard Light, we are expecting to carry out a 5-year study, which we are calling LAS 21, Liberal Arts and Sciences in the 21st Century. I also call it, as a nickname, BBB, Baby Beyond Bathwater, because there may be a lot of bathwater in liberal arts education, but there's a very precious baby. And part of the privilege that I've had, because I've been at an elite university and have had contact with such wonderful mentors, is I see the wonderful things you can have if you can learn about different ways of thinking, you can have contact with young minds, you can continue to grow, I hope even in my age, even in Jerry Bruner's age. We don't want to lose that, either because through MOOCs or through people only being able to study stuff which will land them a first job. But we have to be sensitive to the threats from within, because if people see campuses as places where kids cheat, where they do binge drinking, where they indulge in drugs, illegal drugs, where there's sexual harassment and so on, then they're not going to want to support our liberal arts institutions. There have been wonderful books written about the liberal arts. We have no need to add to the defenses. What we want to do is an empirical study of how the different interest groups on campuses think about education. Incoming students, graduating students, their parents, faculty and staff, trustees and alumni, and importantly, recruiters. Because recruiters, particularly at elite campuses, have enormous power. And if the only recruiters who come from the investment banks, from management consultants, and maybe if you're lucky from Teach for America, that's the message about what the jobs are. And except for Teach for America, I don't think any of the other ones are the shortest distance to good work. When I was an undergraduate at Harvard College in the early 1960s, there was a very thin kid named Bill Drayton, whom I got to know, and he had a table every week at Lowell House called the Ashoka table. And I learned through him Ashoka was an emperor in India thousands of years ago who got to be an emperor the usual pugnacious way, but then tried to be pacific, pacify people, tried to get them to do what I would call good work and so on. Bill was interested in that when I was interested in the girl next door. And then he started 30 years ago something called Ashoka, which was the first social entrepreneur organization in the world. There have now been thousands of people who've been Ashoka Fellows all over the world. And when at my 40th college reunion, I said the most important person in our class was Bill Drayton. Because of what he did, everybody applauded. He's still not as household word like Madonna or Lady Gaga or Justin Bieber or the Kardashians, but he's much more important. And he came out of a liberal education. And I think we need to preserve that. And in my, however many years I have left, that's something that I'm going to work toward.
Is there anything in your research throughout your career thus far that you feel we've missed? That there's a nugget in there that it has not had the impact that you thought it would?
Well, let me just do a little free association, right? First of all, we haven't talked a lot about family, but family is incredibly important to me. I have 4 wonderful kids, all grown up, all productive citizens, all of whom get it ethically and morally, and that's something I'm incredibly proud of. 2 grandchildren, wonderful wife. We haven't talked much about Project Zero, but that's been my intellectual home since 1967. We haven't talked about Project Zero, but that's been my intellectual home since 1967, so we're going on to 50 years. For 28 years, David Perkins and I were the directors of Project Zero, and very unusually for a university, we've since had 2 leadership transitions. Typically at universities, unless an organization is funded by a permanent line, as soon as the leaders disappear, the organization disappears. But this was an organization started by Nelson Goodman, and then we've had these leadership transitions since. Project Zero began with an interest in artistic knowledge. Nelson Goodman, the founder, quipped, well, we know a lot about education in the arts, but we don't know anything systematic. So let's have a systematic exploration of that. And that's been the through line for decades. But if people have heard of Project Zero now, they could have heard of it for a dozen reasons. It's much more known abroad, much better known abroad than the United States, again, because the United States educational policy is so antithetical to what we do at Project Zero, which is teaching for understanding, paying attention to individual differences, talking about the relevance gap, which is what's the most important things for people to know, studying things like global consciousness, globalization. We have an annual institute called the Future of Learning, where we look at technological breakthroughs, biological breakthroughs, things which every politician mentions in the first and last paragraph, but never looks at our educational system to see whether it covers those things. All of my close colleagues have been associated with Project Zero. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of younger people who I've worked with, and we have probably 20 people who've been associated with Project Zero for over 20 years, including my wife Ellen, who's actually been there for 40 years. And that's been an incredible part of my life. And yet, 25 years ago, a journalist came to me and said, I want to do a cover story about you for a science magazine. And I said, well, I'd like you to do it about Project Zero. And I never heard from the person again, because we live in a cult of celebrity personality thing, and people either want to know what someone like I did, someone like me did, or they want to know what our underwear is like. And the notion of people working together over long periods of time to develop a body of work is not something that's of much interest. So my family, Project Zero, I continue to be very much involved in the arts. I will not play the piano for anybody else, but I still play for myself. I'm on the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I'm a very unusual appointment there, but they're very interested in education, and I've been on their education committee for 30 years, so I hope I make some contribution. I'm also on the board here of an orchestra, the Boston Landmarks Orchestra. When I travel, and I travel a lot, I always make time to go to a theatrical production and or a museum. And when I turned 60, my kids wanted to have a big party, and I said, I don't like a party, let's travel. So we went to Iceland, and we spent a couple of weeks there. And when I turned 65, we went to the Galapagos Islands, which was fantastic. And I had a grandson then, and I knew that was a place where he could enjoy it because of the flora and fauna, which Darwin looked at, almost 200 years ago. And we'll do something similar as my 70th birthday comes. So traveling, doing things with my kids. I mentioned the time in China. I was very lucky to be able to go to China a lot. I think there's nothing more educational than having to spend time, or having the opportunity to spend time in different cultures. I didn't go into detail about the beginning of the Good Work Project, but it began in 1994-95. At that time, there were a new set of people elected to the House of Representatives. 80% of them did not have passports. And I thought that was unbelievable in the shadow of the 21st century, that 4 out of every 5 representatives had never traveled abroad and didn't have a desire to travel abroad. We live in a global world, and I think the best gift you can give to students and to your own kids is a chance to travel, and they don't have to stay at the Ritz.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's another thing. My mother is still alive at 101, and I go to see her every weekend and talk to her every day, and she's been through a lot. Let me tell a story about her, and I think maybe that would be a good conclusion. She's a remarkable woman, doesn't have higher education, but knows what's going on, is a fantastic connector. I tend to connect people through ideas. Oh, Audrey, you worked on this, and John worked on that. Maybe you should read each other's stuff. But she connects people through their passions and interests and relatives. And when my father died in 1999 at the age of 91, we decided my mother should move to a retirement place, and she agreed. And the move was the move from hell. The movers were breaking things. They broke the elevator down. She had to sleep in her house with none of her things there. And my sister and I, we both live in Boston, were going nuts. How can these people be so awful? What are we going to do? We're going to sue? And my mother was sitting there very placidly. I said, Mom, this is a disaster. How can you sit there so patiently and quietly? She said, Son, I know what real problems are. And thinking back to what she went through with family and how many people were lost in concentration camps, and thinking of losing her one son when she was pregnant with me, I think it's important to know what real problems are. I'm lucky enough to have had very few real problems in my life, but as I think Marcellus Juarez Orozco told you, maybe I do have a feeling of the frailty of life, and that it's important to use the time you have here as best you can.
Gives you perspective.